I welcome you to all the second episode of ISCM's Prism series. Thank you to all the. So let me go ahead and introduce you to the guest of the evening, Laura Ciceri. She is the founder at Supply Chain Insights. She comes on stage with 35 years of diverse supply chain experience and is a distinguished supply chain researcher. She is the most followed supply chain personality on LinkedIn, and she works with supply chain leaders to take teams at a higher level of excellence. We have Dr. Rakesh Singh. He is the chairman of Institute of Supply Chain Management. He is an expertise in the domain of supply chain, IBP, demand planning, and have taught in some of the best B schools, India, Europe, and Middle East. Both Laura and Dr. Singh have an extensive background in supply chain research, and may I invite them on stage to explore the topic of today, why supply chains perform better than others during disruptions. Welcome, Laura. Welcome, Dr. Singh.
Good morning.
I would request Dr. Singh to kindly take up the conversations ahead. Thank you.
Good morning, Laura, and good evening to all the audience at the show. Laura, you have been a very strong proponent of supply chains. To admire the methodology is amazing, which includes growth, operating margins, inventory turns, return on invested capital. And I think in that sense, it would be interesting to start the debate as to why some supply chains do better than another in the same environment, in the same industry.
Well, first, the companies that do the best have a clear definition of what is supply chain excellence. And that sounds trivial, but that is not. That's actually something that I've been studying for the last 15 years. And a lot of times people will say they want to drive supply chain excellence, but when I ask them the question of what does excellence mean and how does excellence tie to strategy, they cannot answer the question. And so unless there's clarity, the organization is not aligned. And I find that the greater the gap between commercial teams, sales, marketing, corporate communications, and operations teams, distribution, customer service, procurement, transportation, the greater the gap in alignment, the tougher it is for those organizations to work together in disruption. That's number one. Number two is the traditional supply chain response. It does not sense. It is inside out, it's not outside in. And by outside in, I'm talking about a signal that moves market to market, senses market changes, consumption, distribution, and does that with almost zero latency. So the sensing, the time from consumption to the organization seeing that is really small. And then the design of the supply chain is such that that supply chain can operate market to market. Now, the interesting thing is only 9% of companies actively design their supply chain. You know, I'm a chemical engineer. I wouldn't have gotten out of school if I hadn't been able to design distillation columns and heat exchangers. So I'm just shocked that so many companies are not actively designing their supply chain for things like inventory buffer strategies, sourcing strategies, postponement strategies, outsourcing strategies. Instead, I think we've gotten lulled to sleep for tax efficiency or transactional efficiency, and we are not really managing the supply chain as a complex nonlinear system where we design it, we have buffers, we have push-pull decoupling points, we have a clear definition of strategy. Does that help you?
Laura, that's fine. But one thing that you really brought about, and that's very interesting in terms of supply chain, the way they are designed even in India. In terms of transactional, what do you mean by transactional? And when does a supply chain become strategic, or it start contributing to competitive advantage?
Well, the supply chain becomes strategic when it's no longer a functional discussion. So a functional discussion is best transportation, best manufacturing, best procurement. When we're able to look at selling, supplying, manufacturing, logistics together, and how they tie to the business model and how they tie to strategy, then it becomes more strategic. And one of the issues is that most of our associations and a lot of our writing is very much about functional supply chain, procurement, manufacturing. But this concept of source, make, and deliver working together to drive excellence in business models is something that takes it to a higher level and really looks at the alignment. So one of the issues is only 29% of companies can get to total cost. And many times manufacturing or procurement or logistics functions will try to reduce functional costs, and they'll throw the supply chain out of balance, and they'll actually increase costs, because you've got to be able to look at the interaction of source, make, and deliver together to be able to manage total cost. And so a lot of well-intending companies will throw the supply chain out of balance.
All right. I think that takes to your definition of end-to-end supply chain. And I know you have been very critical of people when they talk about end-to-end supply chain. What, according to you, would be end-to-end supply chain in that sense of source, make, and deliver?
To me, the best supply chains start with the customer, and the customer's customer is the start of end to end, and then going to the supplier's supplier, including the logistics and the second and third tier suppliers. And to me, end to end is bi-directional orchestration from the market to the suppliers and back, and asking the questions around, do I have a feasible plan? Do I have the best cost options in terms of sourcing strategies? Am I able to sense and translate demand with near latency to reduce the bullwhip effect? Many times when people talk to me about end to end, it's order to cash or procure to pay, a very transactional, narrow definition that does not drive value. So if I'm only focused on efficiency within the four walls of my supply chain, I will throw the supply chain out of balance. And that has been perpetuated by a lot of transactional oriented technology companies like ERP and consultants, which is not serving us well in the pandemic, because if I can't sense and I can't translate and I can't orchestrate, then I probably will make a lot of mistakes. I will have empty shelves, and I'll have the wrong signal going to suppliers, and I'll have the wrong inventory in my warehouse. One of the issues in the United States right now is those inventories are high, and it's the wrong inventory, and the doors are really blowing off the warehouses because we got the wrong stuff. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does make sense. Let me go to your definition of end-to-end supply chain and make it a little simpler. Most even technology companies look at factory to consumer or factory to supplier, and they break the supply chain into different parts. Largely this is the way people start looking at supply chain. You rightly said that during the pandemic, this may not work. If you look at sourcing strategy of organizations in pandemic, and let me put the larger question of pandemic and the so-called geopolitical risk that's happening, you know better, you've written a lot of articles on those counts. Do you think that the sourcing strategy in future needs to change, one, from a perspective of a firm or a company, and two, from the perspective of a firm and company, but in terms of geography of location?
Well, you asked me a number of questions. Let me see if I can get into some of this. Okay. First of all, if we're actively designing the supply chain, we don't generalize. We look at what makes the most sense across source, make, and deliver together. And how do I minimize risk, and how do I design buffer strategies, and how do I account for the changing friction on borders? The global supply chain is based upon frictionless borders, with the focus now on a more regional focused government, whether it's the UK or the US or China. We have more friction on borders, and that's problematic for supply chains because things take longer to cross borders, paperwork is higher, taxation is higher. And in the design of the supply chain, I would account for that in the design. Now, certain supply chains will be global because materials are sourced from only a few regions of the world. Other supply chains will become more regional. It will be based upon design. Generally speaking, I think we're going to move to more regional supply chains that have more control around buffer strategies and will look at sourcing strategies more holistically. I'll tell you a funny story. I did an article for LinkedIn where I interviewed 35 supply chain leaders. And one of their surprises was that they felt that they had minimized risk in sourcing by diversifying suppliers. But they found that their suppliers used the same contract manufacturers and were in the same regions. And so they really had not diversified. Only 1/3 of companies know where their second and third tier suppliers are. And so I think we're going to get a lot more serious around where are suppliers, who's dependent upon what, and the design of the supply chain for that.
But there are a lot of votaries of local or nearshoring. What are your views? These are geopolitical dynamics that may impact locational strategy for your supply bases. But what happens when you go nearby locations? What should guide the nearby investment by the firms, whether they want to go vertically integrate or they want to go to another country which is close by and diversify from one country to the next country so that they're secure during the pandemics or any natural disasters or any geopolitical threat that they have to their supply bases?
It's hard to generalize. You know, it really gets down to what is the strategy, what's happening in the geopolitical world, you know, shifts in leaders, presidents, country leaders, country structures, change. And so the design of the supply chain really needs to be looking holistically at what's happening. And we need to do a better job of managing what I'm going to call planning master data. Planning master data allows us to look at how much friction is there on the borders. So it's looking at what are the real lead times? What is the real time to get a container off a vessel? What is the drayage time at, you know, whether it's the port of Vancouver or whether it's the port of LA? And what is the feasibility of transportation? And what are we seeing in terms of container availability? We're not good at getting to data and designing the supply chain off of what is really happening and the feasibility of frictionless borders and the movement of logistics. We generalize, and generalizations are dangerous in supply chain.
But do we conduct stress tests in supply chains or some kind of stress test for the supply basis? Because it is very important for us to understand, as Professor David Limke says, that the time to recover and time to survival. If the time to survival is less than the time to recover in these pandemics, businesses may need to look at local supply chains. And they need to, because such pandemics may not happen, but then there are geopolitical tensions and friction based borders may disturb the supply bases during important time of recovery, and that can be like India is facing a great threat from China. There is a border war. There is also a lot of political rhetoric from both the sides, and these frictions are there. And we source, even if you look at our main industry, pharmaceutical, we source 70% of APIs from China. So how does one really look at such situations where dependence is so high?
It gets down to we can't generalize, we've got to design. So the basis a source make and deliver for pharmaceuticals is very different than high tech than for apparel.
Yes.
And we need to not only look at the transactional inputs like labor and sourcing, but we need to look at the feasibility of moving goods and receiving goods across borders. And that's one of the things we're not accounting for. I was working with a toy company that designed a toy that had 36 different parts sourced from different countries. And these countries were difficult to get goods in and out of. And they didn't really look at the feasibility of movement of these goods or sourcing these goods. They were only looking at the lowest cost of that manufacturer. So because they weren't looking at it holistically of make, source, and deliver together and the feasibility of movement of these goods, they had an infeasible plan. We have so many companies chasing an infeasible plan. When we make the choice to cross borders, it should be for a good reason. It should be for unique sourcing. It should be for growing markets. It shouldn't just be to chase the lowest transactional cost. And because we don't design the supply chain and we don't simulate, so discrete event simulation allows me to test the feasibility of the plan. People make a lot of bad decisions.
All right. Now, let me take you to the other side of the supply chain. Recently, Supply Chain Insights came out with a very good work on sales and operation planning, and it has been a great guide for a lot of us to have it as an audit basis for our own understanding and our own supply chain. What, according to you, are the common mistakes people make in terms of planning and in terms of even the short or the long range planning within the context of S&OP, if you could answer this?
I'm going to say 5 things, okay? The first thing is, what is the role of the budget? Budgets are wrong the minute that they're published. If I'm going to anchor the S&OP plan to the budget, I will set S&OP into a death spiral that it will not recover from. S&OP should be anchored in the market. It should be anchored on what is the potential to sell product in the market. And when I do that, I sense what's happening in the market, I translate what's happening in the market, and I remove the functional barriers. Second thing is, what is the role of sales? In 2001, we started a policy of sales collaboration. The concept is that sales knows what the market's going to buy. It's not true. Sales is very politically driven by bonus incentives, and they'll have a negative or a positive incentive on bias based upon what those incentives are. Most organizations do not recognize the bias, and they don't recognize the difference between the sales forecast and the market potential. A lot of times, sales and marketing will have programs that meet their own incentives but are misaligned with the market, and so as a result, the organization will go into a dangerous spiral. Anchor the S&OP process in the market. Third, make sure that your systems and your processes are delivering good outcomes. Many times, people will implement forecasting and they won't hold themselves accountable for, am I improving the forecast and am I improving the inventory signals? So I recommend that companies type supply chains based upon coefficient of variation, And for every supply chain type, they measure forecast value add. And they ask themselves the question of, in demand planning and in the management of inventory, am I improving the signal? 99% of companies that I work with are not. They've put in technology, they've got all of these processes, they've hired all these consultants, and their forecast value add is actually negative 22 to 30%. They would do better without any of the technologies or any of the consultants because they're not holding themselves accountable for, is my work on planning giving me a better signal? So essential. 4, measure improvement based upon a balanced scorecard. The functions should be aligned for reliability, and all functions should tie together for a balanced scorecard. If I measure functional metrics like purchase price variance or OEE for manufacturing or lowest transportation cost, I will throw the supply chain out of balance. Instead, in sales and operation planning, I must align the organization against a balanced scorecard of total cost or operating margin, of growth, of inventory turns, not cash to cash, because we've really moved away from inventory management because we've chased cash to cash by elongating payables. Focus on inventory turns and focus on, is my inventory working for me? And return on invested capital. And if I have a balanced scorecard like that, I can drive organizational alignment and get rid of a lot of the friction of the organization. If I focus and reward the functions on functional metrics, I will throw the supply chain out of balance and the plan will never be actualized. The 5th point is tie planning to execution. Our plan should be built into playbooks. I don't know whether the audience plays rugby or football, but soccer, but in our gaming systems, people will have playbooks. So, when they go to the field, they've got in their head, what are the plays we're going to call? And when those plays happen, everybody knows what to do. S&OP execution should be similar to that. In the planning of the period, you should build playbooks. So whether it's a new product launch outcome or a change in market or a change in competitor, weekly you should change those playbooks based upon what's happening in the market. And sales and operations planning execution. Planning needs to be tied to execution. Now the mistakes people make are the belief in one number forecasting. I'm like, how crazy is this? What one number in this myriad of thousands of numbers do you want to anchor your forecast on? Anybody that talks about one number forecast does not understand the basics of forecasting. The second thing is, I'm going to tightly integrate the marketing forecast, the sales forecast, the supply chain forecast. How stupid is that? Each of those forecasting systems have a different data model, a different purpose, and instead what we've got to do is synchronize and harmonize, then translate across that process. I cannot tightly integrate that because the only thing in common with sales, operations, and financial forecasting is the word forecast. The third thing is not designing the supply chain to look at inventory and buffer strategies and to be able to look at what should the supply chain be and what is the potential. And the fourth is not having a feasible plan. Underneath the meetings, there's a need to look at planned orders and do I have enough manufacturing capacity? As demand variability increases, I need more capacity. As border friction increases, I need to change my logistics plan. So the plan needs to be feasible. And fifth is people don't hold themselves accountable for after action review. They've got a lot of S&OP processes, but they don't ask themselves the question, is am I improving what we're doing? I hope that helps.
Yeah, it does. Thank you very much for this particular clarification. But I think maybe you think everybody understand you in terms of integration, harmonization, and synchronization. But I think this is a very, very critical misunderstanding that supply chain professionals have. And as you rightly said, sales, finance, and supply chain plans have different database and different context. And integrating them may not be the right way, but making them harmonious and synchronizing them together would bring a very strong insight into your own organizational supply chain, which can define your competitive advantage. I would like you to slightly go a little deeper into it, because this is something very interesting in terms of interoperability and market-to-market delivery. So I think if you could bring that particular context here in a simpler word, it would help.
Okay. When I was a Gartner analyst in 2001, I started the research on what would integration look like? What is the CRM data model? What is the financial data model? What is the supply chain data model? I had a group of analysts and we worked 2 years to answer this question. And at the end, we really came back with each of these data models is different, serving a different group of users with a different business purpose. A financial data model is to really guide the financial organization for corporate reporting, for treasury, and the supply chain forecast should be an input into the financial forecast, but never be tightly integrated, and the supply chain forecast should never be constrained for the financial forecast. Because if it's tightly constrained, you'll miss market opportunities. Because the budget is not really synchronized to market. Likewise, the sales forecast is very valuable for pipeline management, for looking at how many salespeople do I need, or perhaps how many trucks I need, or I'm planning for sales, but really cannot be tightly integrated to a supply chain forecast, because the supply chain forecast needs to be accurate at a mix level, which is the number of products that I have, the number of product locations I have, and you really have got to look at, mean absolute percent error or MPE to be able to look at error, and to be able to look at error based upon the numbers of supply chains, based upon coefficient of variation. That's a very different model than the sales pipeline forecast. So my belief, after studying this for 15 years, is let those forecasts be. Let each of those organizations develop their own forecast for their purposes based upon the strategy. And over all 3 of these forecasts, put an analytics layer. You can pick your analytics layer of choice. It could be descriptive analytics like Tableau or Power BI, or it could be one of the lightweight data models like Era Technology or Anaplan, and allow users to query and look at the data models and to be able to bring the data together based upon their need sets. Don't do this on schema on write. Do this, as you need it, because those forecasts are always changing, and hold the supply chain accountable for forecast value add and error and bias, and look at the differences and drive communication. And any consultant that comes and talks to you about one number forecast or tightly integration of forecasts, show them the street, because they just don't understand forecasting.
That's good. I think that sets up the context for the next question in a better way. You have been talking about a S&OP maturity model. And you have rightly said that large number of organizations are somewhere caught up in the middle. while reading and understanding integrated business planning, one gets an idea that it's the ever the line process of bringing change in the organization. Where does it lie according to you in terms of S&OP maturity? Because some people say it's advanced S&OP. When I read your report, it says that it is one of the 5 stages, and it's the 3rd stage of S&OP maturity. While there may be disagreement on that, can you tell us why you have classified that as the 3rd stage and not the last stage, where you bring sales, finance, and SCM together for reconciliation?
Well, I've had many disagreements with Oliver White about this. I'm not really that loved by Oliver White, nor am I loved by the DDMRP group, right? But my research shows that if I'm focused on the enterprise and making the enterprise more efficient, the enterprise will serve itself, but not its customers. And companies that grow and companies that are profitable serve their customers market to market. Market to market is from the customer's customer to the supplier's supplier with bidirectional orchestration. IBP has the concept of making the enterprise more efficient, more integrated, and self-serving. If I, as an organization, are self-serving, I'm really not going to be resilient. I'm not going to be able to understand market activities. Instead, what I need is an architecture that allows me to take consumption data and move consumption data with almost no latency across the functions and align the functions to serve the organization outside in. And outside in processes are not well understood and not really developed enough. So if you think about outside in processes, VMI was an example of an outside in process. In my research, I interviewed 100 companies. No one uses VMI as a sensing signal. They'll bring VMI to order management because there's no place to put it in enterprise architectures. We have more consumption data, more market data than we've ever had before, yet nobody uses it. In the 2007 downturn, General Mills sat on more point of sale data in the United States than anybody else. Sat in the sales organization, they did not read the market, that people walked away from cereal during the recession and didn't return. They built factories, and as a result, they had to do layoffs because they did not read the market. They had the potential with the point of sale data to have read the market and to drive better behavior, but they didn't. They stayed tethered to the order signal, and the order signal is not a good representation of demand. So when we're talking about market to market, we start with consumption, we start with the consumer, we start with the channel, we translate the channel with near latency across the organization, and we get the right information to the suppliers, market to market. It's for that reason that IBP is the 3rd stage in the S&OP maturity, and people that are market to market are 4th and 5th stage. I hope that helps.
Yeah, it does help, but there's another confusion in your maturity stages. You say demand driven is the 4th stage. Given the proliferation of DDMRP literature, is there any correlation between your 4th stage, which is called demand driven, and DDMRP?
No. I think demand driven is anything but DDMRP. I think DDMRP co-opted the term demand driven, has really been dangerous in the market. DDMRP is a translation of order patterns to material requirement planning. DDMRP is very tethered to the order. The order is not a good representation of demand, and DDMRP is only helping me with the translation of an order pattern to material buffers. I'm not saying that that's not valuable, but it's not demand driven, and it is a way of translating an order pattern to materials, and we need to recognize it as that. Demand driven is looking at how do I get market signals into the organization and make them usable. Market to market or market driven is how do I get demand signals from the market through the organization to suppliers and logistics providers and do orchestration of the signal to be able to work at price volume relationships. So for example, as suppliers change pricing, which has happened a lot in the pandemic, or sourcing is more constrained or logistics is more constrained, how do I work this market to market? That is the 5th stage. So DDMRP doesn't even hit my grid. And I think it's done some real damage in the market.
All right, because he's been agreeing that it's a supply synchronization model, and I think there's a lot of debate on that. That we can leave it behind to look into some good element of your maturity model. When we talk about market to market, and when we talk about pandemic, I think there are 3 or 4 things that have happened in this pandemic. One, the way the consumer behaviors have changed in terms of composition of baskets of goods you buy, frequency of buying, volumes of buying, channels that you buy, and so on. And second, if you see the kind of outside that needs to be brought in, there's a lot of challenge like the 2008 crisis of declining macroeconomy across the globe. And yesterday we had we had a figure where it says that the world largely affected markets have been damaged badly in terms of their GDP growth. How do you incorporate these macro variables as an outside in into your demand planning, supply chain management, and market to market alignment of the supply chain?
Let's start with the market and the consumption, because I think what's happening is the phenomena of what I call the hammer and the dance. So as rates of COVID increase, and I actually was ill with COVID in March, as COVID increases, people shut down and they go to their homes and they change their behaviors. They're not at restaurants, they're not at bars, they're not at sporting events, they're not at hotels, they're not on airplanes. All of that affects demand. So in the United States, I couldn't get my favorite toilet paper for 32 weeks. That's a big company with great supply chain processes. They didn't read the market. They really did not design the supply chain because the retailer became a bottleneck. The number of retail doors to get the shifts in demand to the market became a constraint, and they accepted it and they tried to stuff more product through those retail doors, and they couldn't get the product to market. They didn't redesign. They didn't go through the front door of the, retailer. So, big changes. 40% of food in the United States, and I'm sorry, I don't know the stats for India, but just bear with me. 40% of food in the United States goes through restaurants. When people go to their home and they're no longer eating at restaurants, people are buying more flour, more cocoa, more baking goods. Shelves are bare. I've never seen a shelf bare for flour, and all around the world, people write to me about how demand shifted. We're not eating rice in Scandinavia. We have a shift in, our patterns in, Latin America for, what we're buying. Those shifts are happening with the hammer and the dance. And so what we've got to do is we've got to sense locally and what those shifts are and translate the demand to the supply chain with almost no latency. If I'm not good at sensing and I'm not good at translation, then the supply chain will be on the back foot. And if I don't design for the increases in volume, you're going to be like this large CPG company that couldn't get toilet paper and towels to the retail shelf during the pandemic. This particular time requires us to think differently and requires us to use data in different ways. And it's my hope that out of the pandemic, we will build better and we will challenge our systems and our thinking to be outside in. Let me just give you an example. I teach classes where I ask companies and students to draw the supply chain. Love the exercise. You know, the first time that I ask people to do this, they look at me like in disbelief, like I've got crayons and paper on the table. And of the students, only one student has started the drawing with the customer. 99% of students, when they pick up a marker, will draw a supplier or a factory. And that is their mental model of supply chain. It's about supply. It is not about the market and about the customer and about outside in processes. And we must change that. We must change that to build better and to drive higher value for companies in the pandemic.
One more question. I think that's a favorite topic, and you have mentioned that in the fireside chat right now. I'll just read it. Avoid technology built by consultant. So what are your recommendations for people who are looking at technology solutions for aligning supply chain post-pandemic in the 2000s? What would you suggest to them?
I would suggest that they take an inventory of the technologies they have. Many times people will have technologies they don't even know about, and ask themselves the question of how can they use technologies better? So for example, I find a lot of companies will have network design tools and haven't really used them, don't really understand how to use them, don't really understand the basics of form and function of inventory, don't know how to drive a simulation. Look for help to use the tools you have, number one. Number two is spend some time thinking about how do you get market data. Get in a big room and draw all of the outages that you've had. You know, all of the shorts, you know, look at your order short data and ask yourself what data, if you had it, could have helped you to minimize that short. Where is the data? What kind of data? And then look at the tools you have for analytics and ask yourself, how do I use my current analytics tools to basically sense market data and to drive better alignment in the organization on the market? That's the second thing. Love to do these exercises with companies because a lot of times they have data in marketing or sales or R&D that they don't know they have, and they're not using it, and they're not using their current tools. The third thing is don't put an RFP into the market for consultants or a technology. Let's use what we've got, you know, and most RFPs send us into dismal spirals where we're, you know, having lots of discussions that lead to very expensive projects that don't drive value. So let's use what we have and let's measure how effectively we're using our technologies with forecast value add, coefficient of variation, the ability for sensing what is the demand latency from your channel, how do you decrease that? Ground yourself in measurement and align the organization to the strategy. That's my thought.
One last question that is on what kind of capabilities do you think are important to be built in organization and with supply chain professionals to be relevant for future?
I'm currently working on a report on talent. And I think talent is the missing link in the supply chain. And I was talking to a consultant yesterday who had worked for very large consulting companies and was teaching now at a university in the United States called Cornell, and was working on developing a program for supply chain leaders. And I said to him, the three most important things that you need to teach young students is, let's be honest with ourselves. Supply chain management as a practice, source, make, and deliver, started in 1982. We're on the fourth generation of supply chain professionals, and we think we have best practices? No, I don't think so. You know, only 4% of companies are driving performance and improvement faster than their peer group. I think we have historic practices, and I think we have historic practices that we're not really holding ourselves accountable for balance sheet results. So that's number one. Let's be honest. The second thing is, let's teach supply chain leaders how to drive business value, how to talk the language of the balance sheet, how to drive influence management. Most supply chain leaders talk wonk, wonk, wonk talk, acronyms, you know, supply chain language that nobody would understand. Let's teach them influence management. Let's teach them the ability to listen. Let's teach them the ability to problem solve and to speak the language of business. The third is, I find that a lot of students are taken into the world of supply chain and they're a little naive. They don't understand that organizations are really political. They don't understand that sales and marketing are not aligned, or they don't understand that, you know, people in transportation don't necessarily talk to people in sourcing. What I would recommend is that people become change agents to drive alignment, that they bring people together, that they drive facilitated workshops on how groups can work together to drive change. The fourth is to question the status quo, but to do it with respect and humility, and to train yourself on the art of the possible. What are these new techniques? How do I use unstructured data? What is cognitive computing? What's a rules-based ontology? How do I change? What is the art of the possible? Educate yourself. But then influence the organization in ways that are meaningful. You know, you don't have the answers. You only have the spark. Widen your sphere of influence so that you can be a change agent in the right way. And you can enlist a guiding coalition against a problem that your organization has driving the art of the possible. And fifth, and really important, is get to know your customer. Get to know your customer in meaningful ways. Stay grounded in how you serve the customer, because most organizations don't. I'm going to just close with an example. I recently moved and I bought a new washer. The washer got dropped in transit. Doesn't work. New washer, expensive washer, doesn't work. Called the manufacturer, no response. Called the distributor, no response. The new washer is going to come in 3 weeks. I'm not happy, right? No one in that organization cares. Am I going to buy that brand again? No, but my buying cycle for that brand will be a long time. But I'm talking to my friends, right? And my rating and reviews, right, of that particular product will not be good. Make your organization easy to do business with. Care about your customer, deliver against the promise of your customer, and don't lose sight of that.
Okay, thank you, Laura. I think that's sums up the whole discussion very well, and that sums up the talk also very well. I would request you to take few questions which have come to me from some of the senior Indian practitioners. Let me read you the first question. It's from Mr. Ravinder Mithe, who was with KPMG as a partner. Do you really think that supply chain leaders have spent serious time on defining and revisiting supply chain strategy, or they have confined themselves on month-to-month demand management? From Ravinder Mithe.
I think it's hard to generalize. I think supply chain leaders are grounded in supply chain strategy, and I think there's only 4% of the market of their supply chain leaders. And I think companies like KPMG would be well served to help them to change the dialogue.
All right. One more questions that come from Mr. Ravindra Kirkar. How you would like to assess the impacts and make contingency plan for the disruption occurring due to extreme weather, political turmoil, foreign trade exchange, and new advances in technological changes?
I don't understand the question. I think that we have a lot of data sources, whether it's weather or political turmoil, that we can sense and we can build into models for demand sensing. This morning, I got an email from a conference company to join a demand sensing conference. And we have so many bad conferences in supply chain. And I looked at the lineup of speakers, and they're really talking about demand sensing. They're really talking about market sensing. So when I'm really doing market sensing, I'm looking at all of the data that can influence purchase, can influence consumption, whether it's weather or rating and review data or shifts in the channel. And I'm building models and I'm sensing based upon what's happening in the market. And that's different for what I'm selling.
Laura, I have a question. It has been very, interviewing me over a period of time, that large number of professors from MIT, including Yossi Sefi and others, have been talking about ResiLink and LlamaSep, their ability to map the whole, all the tiers of supply chain and bring visibility. What are your views on that? They say that you can actually understand the map and you can understand which tier of the supplier has been affected and you can make a course correction.
I'm a big proponent of network design and simulation tools, and LlamaSoft is one of those. ResiLink is not. And whether I'm using OMP or I'm using AIMS or I'm using LlamaSoft, I think that the ability to see how supply chain functions come together in complex nonlinear systems and the simulation of that to get feasibility. And I'm talking about discrete event simulation. I'm not talking about what if optimization. It helps me to be sure that I have a feasible plan. I'm also very bullish about the growth of the digital twin technology, which would allow me to have a parallel instance to be able to look at those trade-offs and the feasibility. And on digital twin, you can throw in some other technology companies, whether it's Era or Blue Crux or Intera, but we're starting to get some cognitive computing, digital twin work that can help us with, what are the trade-offs and how do I manage the feasibility of a complex nonlinear system. I think those technologies and the ability to simulate and to do what if, really, really essential. Now, we have a lot of risk management tools, whether it's, Resilience 360 or ResiLink or, Tealbook, that are really looking at pieces of risk. And, the risk management world is one that I think is very narrow. And I'm like, we can't really manage risk if we look at narrow. We've got to manage risk by looking at the whole. And so I'm not a big proponent of the risk management market. And, I had this conversation with a company yesterday. I wasn't their best friend, but, it's like, people talk to me about their building control towers. And I'm like, what are you trying to control, right? Let's get centered on what we're trying to control. Visibility doesn't translate to control. And, design, simulation, aligning the supply chain for purpose, that's where my heart is.
Thank you. And one last question. How do you design a supply chain around people and stakeholders to allow collaboration, analysis, innovation, and even mitigation in the time of VUCA work? I think you have answered all these questions over a period of time, but you could just respond to this. Do you want me to read it again?
Yeah, I'm not sure I understand the question.
You can't have a plan for supply chain disruption, but as you have rightly said, we can certainly design a supply chain for disruptions. How do we design a supply chain around our people and stakeholders to allow collaboration, analysis, innovation, and even mitigation?
I think that we have to find a way to have simulation and discrete event work. It's centerpiece in cross-functional processes. So whether it's sales and operations planning or new product launch or choices on sourcing, putting it in those processes to be able to look at trade-offs is very helpful for organizations, because when you're doing discrete event simulation, you see patterns that you don't see in an Excel spreadsheet. But we have to make that a centerpiece of these horizontal processes.
All right. Thank you, Laura. Thank you for getting up so early in the morning to talk to all of us, and some of the good supply chain guys here are listening to you. I have already got some messages that the way you have been taking the questions and putting it in a more palatable way has been very interesting. I will ask Jaisal to give a vote of thanks to you.
Thanks. Let me know if I can help. I answer all questions on LinkedIn, and send me your questions.
Dr. Singh, and thank you, Laura. Indeed, a really interesting session, and I think we would have taken some more time to listen to you. Good takeaway for audience, I'm sure, and thank you for being there, and thanking all the attendees for coming and attending this session and listening to us. And last but not the least, thanks to the entire ISCM team for making it happen. Thank you once again, Laura, and have a great day ahead.